Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. Ever since the country first encountered Donald Trump as a presidential candidate, the prevailing question has been, how bad can he get? And the answer, time and time again, has been worse than we could have imagined. With each new campaign, including his most recent one, Trump has been ever more, Trumpian, reaching higher and higher levels of dishonesty and viciousness that we thought no United States president could ever approach. We are about 2 weeks in now from the fateful 2024 election, 9 weeks until the inauguration of Donald Trump, and a mere 217 weeks until the end of his second term. The hope against hope view would be something like this. Having achieved a decisive victory and vanquished his political opponents, and with his focus typically fixed on himself rather than his campaign promises, Trump could lean toward a half-crazy second term. Perhaps he might even aim to secure a place in history that distances him somewhat from his current standing as the most authoritarian and feckless figure in American presidential history. But the got hope school is rarely made out well in the Trump era, and the early signals from this pre-inauguration period suggest they'd be wise to temper expectations even more. Trump's near-feral instinct for perpetual offense and chaos is already on full display in his first days as president-elect. Having the huge upper hand of Republican control of all three political branches, not to mention his very strong support in the U.S. Supreme Court, Trump is taking steps to bring to heel the Republican caucus in the U.S. Senate. He has rolled out a series of truly outlandish nominations for key administration positions, practically daring the Senate to defy him. Two of them, Matt Gaetz for Attorney General and Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence, seemed chosen for their patent unsuitability and shock value. And he's now making noises about using recess appointments to install those nominees, a maneuver that would warp the constitutional design of Senate advice and consent. Moreover, he's proposing a system of outside review and oversight generals that would make the military one step closer to his private militia. The early evidence from the post-election period points strongly in the direction that his opponents warned the country about for the last year. As one of our guests on today's podcast put it, we are about to experience an unprecedented assault on the Constitution and an abandonment of norms related to the military, the Justice Department, and government contracting that will make the first term look, normal. To take stock of the evidence of the first few days of Trump's post-election moves and the extent to which they are harbingers of a genuine assault on democracy to come, we welcome three of the country's most thoughtful commentators. And they are Bill Kristol, the editor-at-large at The Bulwark, which, Bill, I just want to say as a side, has really been killing it and becoming such an important voice, and is founder and director of Defending Democracy Together. He previously founded, famously, The Weekly Standard in 1995, edited that influential magazine for over 2 decades, and he served in important positions in 2 Republican administrations. Also the host of the excellent video series and podcast, Conversations with Bill Kristol. So very happy that you can join us. You've been frequently doing of late, and we're so grateful.
Happy to be with you again.
Mara Liasson is a national political correspondent for NPR. Her reports can be heard regularly on NPR's programs Morning Edition and All Things Considered. During her tenure, she has covered 7 presidential elections and administrations. And prior to her current assignment, she was NPR's White House correspondent for the 8 years of the Clinton administration. Welcome back to Talking Feds, Mara Liasson.
Thanks for having me.
And Heather Cox Richardson, a historian and history professor at Boston College, where she teaches 19th century American history, and it's a very valuable historical perspective. But every time I introduce you, Heather, I think that really unduly narrows your focus, because her excellent daily Substack newsletter, Letters from an American, chronicles current events in the larger context of American history, and that is how I think millions of Americans have come to know you. Her most recent book is Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America. Thanks very much for joining us again, Heather.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. Trump's cabinet designations are dropping like recruits from some extreme and bizarre alt-government farm team, including, to name just a few, Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence, Matt Gaetz, Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Health and Human Services Secretary, Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary. Who are these folks, and how do they compare with the roster you would expect from a conventional Republican administration, which this surely is not?
Well, I mean, the easiest thing is to compare it with the roster of the first Trump administration, which was the most recent Republican administration. So we don't have to get into complexities of Bush Republicans and
Right.
Reagan Republicans and so forth. And let's just compare Pete Hegseth and Jim Mattis. I guess we can go down the list, right? Matt Gaetz with Jeff Sessions, whatever, he had limitations, but a 20-year member of the Senate, and I guess this is Judiciary Committee member and so forth. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as opposed to a conventional member of Congress, honestly, whatever his name was, Price, but, again, not crazy, though a little corrupt. I believe they bumped him pretty early. Tulsi Gabbard, a pro-Putin, pro-Assad, 3-term member of Congress, compared to Pompeo, actually, a pretty serious senator, if too Trump compliant at times for me, but whatever, a real CIA director, and then followed by Gina Haspel. So, I mean, it's just the first term was not great, but the first term, there were people who were respectable and who actually saw their job as mostly keeping to the law and the Constitution and checking Trump's authoritarian designs and the designs of others around Trump, marginalizing Steve Bannon those first few months, for example, helping force Mike Flynn out of the White House that first month. And now we have the opposite. All the people who got forced out of the Trump first term are in there and being promoted to offices way beyond any normal view, I think, would say that they're qualified for. It's as if the people who Trump tried to engineer the coup with in those last 2 months, in some cases literally the same people, incidentally, are now the people Trump's put in charge. So this is the thing I regret the most, having been involved a bit in the 24 election. We just could not bring home to people that the Trump second term wouldn't be like the Trump first term. They took a false reassurance from a somewhat rosy view, actually, of the Trump first term, but that nothing went that far off the rails. I mean, things did go pretty far off the rails, but still. But you're seeing it all now. I mean, there's no pretense at this point, I think.
I think the chapter heading here is he wasn't kidding. It was amazing to me. I've never covered a presidential election where the candidate's supporters, his surrogates, including his vice presidential running mate, kept on going to great lengths to tell us he was kidding, he was joking, he was sarcastic, he doesn't mean it, he won't do it. Well, wrong. And this is pretty clear. He did talk about this during the campaign. I wouldn't have thought that the first democratic institution he tried to undermine would be the Republican-controlled Senate. Now, that was a surprise. He's basically said, confirm these picks or there'll be recess appointments. So confirm them and put aside any of your independent thought. Don't confirm them, and your role as a co-equal branch of government is over, pretty much. So that's the choice they have. You've got Matt Gaetz, who is supposed to run the Department of Justice. So rule of law is out the window. He's already talked about getting rid of the FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. You have a Putin apologist running NDI. What does that mean? Does she hand over intelligence? Which one of our allies would want to share intelligence with us, with her at the helm of that? Then you've got Pete Hegseth. I think that the search for woke generals and the desire to do a kind of mass house cleaning at the Department of Defense, what is the purpose of that? What is the purpose of making sure these generals are loyal to Trump and not Trump number one and the Constitution number two? What is the purpose of that? It sounds like it's a recipe for making America weaker.
Oh, I think he wants to make sure that they win in 2028 and other things like that, and also wants to suppress dissent and deport immigrants and so forth.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'd say just on the very first point, and I want to yield to Heather, obviously, is I agree with you that it's sort of ironic that he's going after the Republican Senate first, but it makes absolute sense, right?
Yes.
What do you do if you want to be an extremely powerful, personalized executive power? You need to subvert the other institutions that have some ability to check you. There's the Senate. They have advice and consent. You need to undermine that right away. So in a certain way, there's a real logic to what he's doing.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree.
It's really not first. He's got the Congress already, so those have been conquered, but it is really ambitious, I'll say in neutral terms, to have the Republican Senate in his sights when you could see them as someone he would work with. I just want to call on you again for your historical perspective. There's been a lot of talk during his first term about, yes, autocratic, but we've had this before, Andrew Jackson or Buchanan, or you think about things like this. I mean, these, in some cases, and I single out Matt Gaetz for the reasons that Mara said from my own vantage point, but the nominees seem beyond awful, incompetent, as Bill says, to perverse, almost the person you would choose if you were trying to tear down the institution, not almost, the person you would choose if you're trying to tear down the institution they're heading. So I just wonder if you see this as part of a general strategy of demolition of what Trump sees as the deep state, and if there's a parallel in American history for it. I know that's a whole semester of questions for you, but if you can kind of give us your overall top-line thoughts.
Well, I don't think it's very valuable at this point to look back to Andrew Johnson or Andrew Jackson or James Buchanan or anybody who operated with a government that was significantly smaller and had no global role virtually at all in those periods, because what we are looking at in the post-World War II era is one that is shaped by the rule of law, both domestically and the international rules-based order internationally. And so trying to look at this moment and say, well, it'll be okay because we've survived Buchanan is not, I think, very, very valuable. But weirdly, I'm going to be both more negative and more positive than Mara and Bill in that I think quite deliberately these, and they're not appointments yet, many of them are trial balloons, are designed both to shock people, to make them upset, to make them look away from some of the really dangerous things he's done. But they are also very deliberately, as Mara says, designed to tear apart the very basics of small d democratic government. So get rid of the rule of law by putting Matt Gaetz in charge of the Department of Justice. Get rid of our Defense Department by putting a Fox News channel host, part-time host at the head of it. Tearing down the key pieces of our intelligence, for example, which I think the answer to who will share their intelligence with the U.S. from now on is no one, because that would be absolutely suicidal. And of course, the great strength of our military is not the things that go boom, it's our intelligence. So I think all those are deliberate, but I'm going to come back to the fact that the Republican Party is not in lockstep with Donald Trump. He wants it to be. This is why he is trying so hard to put pressure on the Senate Republicans. But when it came time to vote for a Senate Majority Leader, I believe that his handpicked choice, Rick Scott, got 13 votes out of 53 in the first secret round, of course.
On a secret ballot.
On a secret ballot. Which again is a huge deal, but that they only felt like they were comfortable doing it when they were in secret. But I'm going to come back to the idea that Trump, we know, can command his voters. And we think from exit polls from the 2024 election that about 22% of his voters were evangelical voters. They went for him by 18% of those voters. But it also appears that he can't transfer those voters to anybody else. And he's 78 years old. And he's not in good mental health. So there is a political calculation to be made that says, how much can he really do for somebody in 2026 when people don't turn out for the midterms? Okay, maybe he's alive in 2026, but do we really think he's going to be the person in the White House in 2028? And if he's not, can anybody else command his followers? And if that's the case, is it really worth destroying American democracy? Because this is what we're looking at, to back him in this moment when he did not get 50% of the American voters, and that many of the people who voted for his ticket did not want what he's offering. It seems to me there is more wiggle room on the part of established Republicans than we are currently saying, is it being a landslide to hell.
I mean, so I'm not sure they all get confirmed. I agree with one level with Heather. My problems, I've been saying this for 8 years, that of course people can see that it's in their interest to be the leader of the non-Trump Republicans. It hasn't been in anyone's interest to be the leader of the anti-Trump Republicans. It may be in some people's interest to be not super closely associated with Trump and have a slightly different independent persona. So let's say Glenn Youngkin in Virginia or something like that. You go along with Trump, you don't criticize him. And I could see some in the Senate quietly voting to confirm. But if you vote against Trump on a high-profile nomination, I think you have a very grim future in the next few years in the Republican Party. And I think the people who know better, whether they're young, ambitious people like a Tom Cotton, who is, after all, going to be head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and the idea that he could vote for Tulsi Gabbard is extraordinary. And I used to know Tom pretty well. And he doesn't, I'm sure, think Tulsi Gabbard should be director of national intelligence. On the other hand, I wouldn't bet on him voting against it. You know what person could make a difference here? Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell is 81 years old. Mitch McConnell has 2 more years in the Senate. Mitch McConnell, incidentally, cares about vaccines since he didn't have one when he was a young boy, and he couldn't get the polio vaccine, I think, and he had polio, And so if Mitch McConnell gets Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski and Tom Tillis, they just have to write a letter to Donald Trump and just say, we can't support some of these nominees. We'll support good nominees who are much closer to you than to me on a lot of issues. You can have conservative, even America First-ish and Project 2025-ish nominees. You just can't have these people. That would stop it. And the fact that, but Mara's right, I think that the fact that me saying this is so far removed from what people are saying in Washington. And maybe it'll happen, incidentally. Maybe we'll all be surprised next week. But you cover it day to day, Mara. But you don't even need the ambitious ones, where I think it's a little more complicated. Cuts both ways. You just need 4 people who are retiring to say what I'm saying, right?
That's theoretically how you stop them. But boy, I mean, I just don't see it. I would put money on that every one of these guys gets confirmed, and women gets confirmed. I mean, this is the Trump party. What's so interesting to me is he didn't have any coattails to speak of, but he still has total control. I mean, they won the 3 red state Senate seats.
But he ran ahead of the Republicans.
Yes. Why didn't he bring in more House members? I mean, somebody who wins this decisively at the top of the ticket, you'd think he had more juice down ballot.
This is a problem of the media and the Democrats. I mean, it was an amazing comeback, and it is horrifying that the public was willing to ignore everything and give 50% of its vote to Trump, from my point of view. So I stipulate all that. On the other hand, the coverage of this, he won by half of what Biden won by in 2020. He won by less than Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by in 2016.
And he got very few more votes than he did in 2020, something like 1 million.
Yeah, less than 1 million. The real story here, and it's coming out, very good article in the Washington Post today about the campaign funded by sort of Musk allies to have deceptive ads targeted to Harris voters. What really happened is 9 million or whatever depression of Harris votes. But one thing that you might have been thinking of, and I certainly want to talk about, is our new Department of Government Efficiency to be run by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. So much of this sounds like something out of 1984, but what's its potential for really having its tentacles, broadly inserted in American life?
This is going to be very interesting because, of course, they have said they're going to cut at least $2 trillion from the U.S. government. And we know that's not possible without going after things that Trump voters really desperately want and depend on. So we know that counties that vote for Trump are more heavily dependent on federal monies through Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and also that rural counties are more reliant on food assistance than urban counties are. Again, this is an intellectual problem. It's a political intellectual problem. That is, it is not possible for Trump to do the things that he has promised to every constituent. It's like promising that you're going to be wet and dry at the same time. It is not possible to put up these tariffs and keep prices low. It's not possible to protect abortion in the states or give it back to the states and have a national abortion bill. It is not possible to cut 30% of the government and continue to give your voters the things they want. So So what do you do? I mean, again, what do you do about that? Do you say, as Musk has said, well, you're just going to have to suck it up. There's going to be hardship and you guys are going to be really badly hurting? Or do you kick it down the road and say, we did these things even though we didn't? To me, the theme of this elected administration so far is really chaos. And I think for me, all of it, all the chaos, what's going to happen and all the alarm goes back to what I think it was Bill was saying. Who wins if we get rid of our intelligence, if we get rid of our Defense Department in any meaningful way, if we get rid of the public health measures that keep, millions of us from dying, if we get rid of education, if we get rid of all these things, who are the people that win? And I think that broader lens is the one that I find the most intriguing right now, because it's clearly not America. So who's in line to win from this? Is it just oligarchs like Musk, or is it oligarchs like Musk in bed with oligarchs like Putin?
Bill, you wrote that, citing an interview Bannon gave to Michael Lewis. The Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. And you wrote, they're flooding the zone with appointments that stink up the joint. It's disorienting, as it's intended to be. So just to amplify Heather's question, is there some tyrannical strategy that just sees chaos not as a collateral problem, but as literally a political goal that serves to augment his power and defang the opposition?
Yeah, I think there's a method to the madness. I'm slightly, maybe a little more than Heather, on the side of method as opposed to chaos or madness. I'm not sure we differ that much on this. I think, many people have written about this. Authoritarians often like a lot of chaos, a lot of balls in the air, so to speak, distracts people. You do promise a lot of people things. If you're a good enough demagogue, you don't end up paying much of a price when you don't deliver on the promises. He built the border wall, no problem. Did he lose a single vote in 2024 because the border wall, or 2020, because the border wall wasn't built? I mean, I think the policy contradictions are really true, but I don't have much doubt about how he's going to resolve them all. He's going to resolve them all in the way that's most popular, and he's not going to cut anyone's benefits seriously, except certainly not his own voters. I mean, some of these issues are complicated. I mean, I do think his voters kind of expect big deportations. He deep down probably knows that going too far in that direction would be a mistake. And so you could do some sort of moderate, bad deportations and so forth. But I do think the consistent through line is augmentation of his own personal power and presidential power at the expense of everything, of other institutions in government, of people outside government, intimidating people outside government to get along. And you mentioned, Harry, that fake office, that Elon Musk is running with Vivek as his sidekick, I guess. It's not a government office. They'll never set up a government office, but then they'll be covered by, rules of disclosure and FOIA and a conflict of interest. So they're just going to go around the government. No one can refuse to have a meeting with Elon Musk or share documents with him. He's there on behalf of Trump. He gets to see everything that's going on in the government. He's meanwhile got huge business interests. He's the richest person in the world. It's in everyone else's interest then to who's going to say no to Elon Musk about anything in the private sector? If you're a bank, if you're a financial institution, if you're an automaker, and Elon Musk wants something and he has access to all the government, he can decide, hey, this program is wasteful. This program that benefits, I'm making this up, a Chrysler EV, very wasteful. We got to get rid of that. We have to only have programs that benefit his electric vehicles. I mean, the degree of personal corruption and sort of collapse of any notion of sort of rule of law, standards for judging policies that aren't simply crony capitalism. That is a through line that's going to be very consistent in this administration, I fear.
I put that in the same basket as undermining democratic institutions, rule of law, end of our intelligence, everything goes to Putin. That, to me, is more important than whether he actually is going to cut something out of the government or not. Remember when he renegotiated NAFTA and it became the US-Mexico trade agreement? It was no different than NAFTA, but he said it was new and improved. He can make a few performative cuts. He can make some performative deportations. And I don't think that voters will really care. What they care about is they want him to bring down prices and make sure the border is secure. I think that's what they want. So can he wave a magic wand and bring down prices? I don't think so. Joe Biden would have done that if it was possible. But that's how I think he'll be judged. But I think the other stuff, the changing the rules of the game, the undermining democratic institutions, That's what people have to keep their eye on the ball of that.
All right, let me zero in on that. Matt Gaetz is, I think, under any way of looking at it, vulnerable, at least. Thus, Trump wants to go the recess appointment route. You've written a lot about this in particular, Heather, but it seems like, I'll just say from my constitutional background, the antithesis of what a recess appointment is supposed to be, and something that would just cut the not just advice and consent of the Senate, but the American people's ability to have hearings, have things aired that are genuine problems with Gaetz. Do you think, Mara, that they're all going to get confirmed? Are you thinking he'll go the recess appointment route, or will Republicans blink and say, we don't even want this crap, this hearing, we'll put a bag over our head and vote to confirm?
I don't know, because what he's really saying is, if you vote to confirm, then you have preserved the fig leaf of advice and consent, that the Senate is still an institution. But if you don't confirm them, I'm going to totally undermine that fig leaf and put them in as recess appointments. I mean, either way, it's pick your poison there. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the Senate will finally decide. I think what Bill sketched out, that there could be 4 people, McConnell, Tillis, and, Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. I mean, that could happen. I think it's highly unlikely.
And I'm going to split the baby and say that some of them will go through.
Well, wait, we're only talking about the 3, really. We're talking about Hegseth, Gaetz, and Tulsi. We're not talking about Marco Rubio. We're talking about the 3 egregious kind of
3 or 4, yeah.
RFK is right up there too.
Yeah, well, yeah, I put him in a different category, but yeah.
Yeah, the 4 horsemen, yeah. Bill, you wrote that you're even more worried about Tulsi Gabbard. Why is that? And let's just put this in the mix and just acknowledge at least the possibility that some Republicans might be genuinely concerned about terrible erosion of the safety, security, and rule of law in the country, and think that that's what these nominations portend.
I mean, the degree to which they're already cowed is what's striking. I mean, on Earth 2, these people don't get nominated. Or if they're nominated literally on the first day they're nominated, serious people in the Senate, at least privately, go to Trump or Susie Wiles, the chief of staff, and say, we can't do this. I mean, I'm chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. I'm not going to support and work with Tulsi Gabbard as director of national intelligence. I won't say anything publicly. Find an excuse to withdraw her and send her off to some, ambassador someplace. We'll move ahead. That's what happens in the real world of American politics that we've lived in for 70 years, I would say, basically. And there are people in the Senate, I think Heather's right about this, who of course know that and think that, whether it's the younger types like Tom Cotton on the legal side. It's not like John Cornyn, whatever, was a judge in Texas. He's a pretty sober guy. He doesn't think Matt Gaetz should be head of the Justice Department. And honestly, even Ted Cruz doesn't think so, I think, his Supreme Court clerk. And there are other people. Anyway, it's just the degree to which they're all totally cowed. I don't even think they're privately saying what I just said.
Why do you think that is?
That's a deep question. I mean, part of it is the fear of electoral stuff. And part of it is they won't have a future. And they think the voters, or enough of the voters, 60% of the Republican voters, are so much in Trump world that if Trump turns on them, they'll never have a future, and Trump will call them out, and that Trump isn't interested in listening to their private thing. I know part of it is deep down, maybe they sort of half agree with Trump and they like the Trumpist transformation of American politics, or they just feel like they can't fight it at this point after 8 years. I don't really know. Just one on Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, I'm a little more on the national security side of things, I suppose, as opposed to the lawyers and all this. So I mean, it's unbelievable that she could be director of national intelligence. Obviously, our allies aren't going to share intelligence with us, but we have the main source of intelligence, for our allies. The degree that she creates a genuine crisis in governance is a little underappreciated. What do you do if you're a senior career intelligence official and you get a request from DNI headquarters, like a briefing on what's going on with the Syrian opposition and how they're doing against Assad? What's going on in Ukraine? What's going on with some of the efforts to undermine Russian missile production, or disrupt the Iranian sale of missiles? Do you give her that report? You have to. I mean, she's director of national intelligence. Are you confident that that report isn't going right into the wrong hands and undercutting our allies? No, you can't be confident with her. And so it's so beyond the normal, I don't really like the current director and he's kind of a hack and, I'm going to have to dumb down my reports because he's lazy. I mean, the kind of normal bureaucratic unhappiness with mediocre appointments. We're so way beyond that. And I don't know what happens. I think the degree of brain drain from the federal government if these people get confirmed. I know personally, and I don't know that many people at Justice, you would know a million more, Harry, 2 youngish lawyers at Justice who are not even that political or ideological, who love being at the Department of Justice and here in DC, are leaving. I mean, they'll see if they get jobs, but they plan to leave. They could survive 4 years by going off into the Department of, I don't know, the people who do the lawsuits when the federal government pays too much for an automobile or something, and you go,
Right.
but they're doing interesting stuff now. They wanted to be at Justice because they wanted to help support important things, and I don't know, what does the government look like after 4 years of these people in charge? So.
It's now time to take a moment for our Sidebar feature, which explains some of the issues that are prominent in the news. Today's feature is about music copyright law, the law that grants creators exclusive rights to use and reproduce their original works, but only for a specific period of time, after which the rights revert to the public at large. And to explain the law, we welcome Will Butler. Will Butler is quite the multi-talent. He was formerly and first came to fame as a member of the great indie band Arcade Fire. He has since forged a whole new career as a Grammy-winning and Oscar and Tony-nominated musician and songwriter, and along the way he took a little stop to get a mid-career master's in public administration at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And he is also part of the band Will Butler and Sister Squares. I've spoken with him about both politics and music, and he is really a wide-ranging, thoughtful person to boot. So anyway, please welcome Will Butler discussing music copyright law.
Copyright protections have a long history in the United States, dating back to the Constitution itself. The Constitution specifically grants Congress the authority to give creators exclusive rights with a clear purpose, to promote the progress of science and useful arts. In practice, U.S. copyright law provides creators with a form of monopoly protection for original works of authorship for a specified time period. Essentially, this means the copyright holder, whether an individual or group, has exclusive control over the distribution, commercialization, and display of their work. This protection, comparable to patent protection, applies to basically all forms of original art, whether painting, writing, film, multimedia, or music. Copyrighting music has always been tricky and is often controversial. Logistical complications arise from the various forms of copyright protections that apply to music. First, creators can obtain separate copyrights for the underlying composition of a piece, and also for its physical recording. Second, copyright holders can license their music in 6 primary ways, each tailored to different uses. There's the sync license, which allows music to be synced with video content, the public performance license for playing music in public spaces, and the mechanical license, which covers reproductions, like a cover version or making a remix. Then we have the master recording license, which grants rights to the original version of a song and is often used in ads. There's the print license for sheet music replication, and finally the blanket license, which allows large catalogs of music to be used like in radio broadcasts. Each of these licenses has its own tortured legal history due to the ever-changing nature of sound reproduction, from the late 19th century player piano to vinyl LPs to kids lip-syncing on TikTok. Digital streaming has brought new challenges to music copyrights, but making it harder to keep track of who deserves payment for a particular use. To address this, Congress passed the Music Modernization Act of 2018. The act created a system to catalog all mechanical licenses, making sure that musicians are paid for every physical and digital reproduction of their work. It also modernized the process for handling music royalty litigations and introduced new protections for sound recordings made prior to 1972, as well as for producers or engineers who contributed to these recordings. As ever, the courts play a role too. In 2018, the Ninth Circuit upheld a ruling that the song Blurred Lines by Pharrell and Robin Thicke infringed on the copyright of Marvin Gaye's Got to Give It Up, expanding the protections of copyright to include concepts like hooks and bass lines and distinctive percussion, though not quite so far as to protect all-encompassing vibe. Incidentally, the ruling spurred Pharrell to complete a master's degree in music theory to understand how the heck he lost the case. Copyright law is a delicate balance between protecting creators' rights and keeping pace with rapidly changing technology. As new tools reshape how music is made and shared, copyright laws will keep evolving too. For Talking Feds, I'm Will Butler.
Thank you, Will Butler. You can hear Will's work in the play Stereophonic, nominated for more Tonys than any play of all time. And 2 of those nominations were for his orchestrations and score. That's currently on Broadway through January 12th. And if you're in New York, go catch him play January 19th at Joe's Pub, the great downtown New York spot that is a part of the Public Theater. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we uncork the notion of drinking bottled wine versus canned wine. Yeah, wine in a can. Wine connoisseurs may stay true to the bottle, but wine connoisseurs have adopted the untraditional packaging for its added convenience, ideal for picnics, concerts, and outdoor events, really anywhere corkscrews are scarce. And since aluminum cools faster than glass, it reduces the time it takes to chill your favorite Sauvignon Blanc. But swirling your wine in a glass does help it open up, which gives it a lot more flavor. Of course, you can always transfer your canned wine to a glass, but if you're looking to experience the subtleties of a nice bottle, drinking from a glass adds a lot. There are wines more suited to the bottle, and there are those well suited for the canned life. Crisp and sparkling whites and rosés in particular tend to fare best in cans, but bigger, bolder wines will usually benefit from a nice glass. It would seem both have their place. Still on the fence between bottles or cans? There's always wine in a box.
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. So much of this seems alarmist and hyperbolic, but here's something I really do know. Whether people generally appreciate it, it's not just the, heart and soul of the Department of Justice, but it's the heart and soul of the rule of law in the country. Over 100,000 really dedicated public servants. And even if they style themselves, as many do, as not particularly partisan, what's it like when the new boss comes in and is clearly opposed to your whole mission in life? There's the boot on the neck problem that I've spoken to people that's just, geez, life is short. And, I came to DOJ and sacrificed a lot of money because of the day-to-day, satisfaction and gratification of doing the right thing. Now I will either have to do the wrong thing or bob and weave or hide or even bureaucratically push back, as people are saying that people will do in different agencies. My boss is there to make my life miserable if and when I do. Who the hell needs it? And that, that's also part of, I think, modern day autocratic decline, not boots in the streets, just control exercise from top that makes otherwise good people and public-oriented people apathetic. It just makes their own personal sacrifice too great, and a lot of them withdraw.
Mara, what about journalism? How do you think it's going to answer?
Well, that's another question. Is he really going to try to yank the broadcast licenses of CBS and MSNBC? He could certainly zero out funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I don't think that would be very difficult. But a lot of these broadcast licenses are not federal, they're local and they're state. Does he have a whole movement to do that? Does he try to get Elon Musk to buy, I don't know, the Washington Post, the New York Times is probably not for sale, but there's probably a lot he can do. Also, don't forget, in the new media landscape, which is super fractured, and he clearly understood it and took advantage of it more skillfully than Kamala Harris, even though she had her day on TikTok. But, the Joe Rogans of the world are now kind of supplanting they're the new Walter Cronkite of sorts. So I think there will be a lot of self-censorship. You only have to put 2 heads on a pike outside the castle. You don't need 24 heads on a pike. And people will be careful. This is like textbook stuff that we've been told for the last 8 years, how democracies devolve because people obey in advance. And you saw the oligarchs obeying in advance, Zuckerberg and Bezos and all of Silicon Valley and Jamie Dimon. And this is what happens. People are not just afraid of their livelihoods. I mean, a lot of the reasons that all those members of Congress retired or resigned, they were getting death threats and their families were getting death threats, and people don't want to put up with that. It's scary.
Just one thing, Jamie Dimon, since you mentioned him, and I particularly dislike him, and he was the one who was said in Davos in January that, we can live with Trump, Harris, pluses and minuses, positioning himself to get along. So then Trump put out this tweet. Jamie Dimon, I respect him, but he'll have no job in the Trump administration. It's not because Jamie Dimon wants a job in the Trump administration, though I don't know. I imagine being Secretary of Treasury is something people don't really turn down. This is where Trump is such a clever demagogue and bully in certain ways, right? You humiliate your opponents a little bit extra.
Yes, like Mitt Romney eating frog's legs or whatever that was.
Yeah, and you sort of really make them. And people don't get scared of that. And this is where I think the preemptive capitulation of the business community, which we are way down the road on already, and then other parts of America, that's where it really starts to get scary, because we always say correctly that, we have a huge civil society, a huge disparate economy, federalism. This isn't Hungary. We're not all, you can't just take 3 universities and 2 newspapers and 3 businesses and be, kind of in charge, right? And Musk is not, in his own way, he's crazy, probably not stupid about this either, right? And someone mentioned this to me, this civil lawsuits, which isn't the federal government, the Justice Department. Musk can fund $10 million of civil lawsuits and nuisance lawsuits that will be very intimidating to journalists. I mean, you libeled me because you said at some point that I'm an autocrat, and then we're each hiring lawyers and stuff. So
the financial pressure could be huge, but also don't forget Musk, in addition to being the richest man in the world and the buddy in chief, he is the single biggest recipient of government contracts. And nobody bats an eye at that. But yeah, no, I think all that stuff is really, really scary to people, and they're going to retreat.
So I would like to point out that Jamie Dimon did respond to that tweet, in which he said, "Thank you, but I have not worked for anybody else for 25 years, and I was not about to start." One of the things that does concern me, and I'm beside myself as a historian about where we are in this moment, but Trump is not all powerful. He is a human being who is 78 years old and has tapioca for brains right now. And the degree to which we build him up as he can do anything, he's going to take all this over, I think that contributes to the idea that he is unstoppable. I would be one hell of a lot more concerned if he were 40. The fact that he is in the state he is in and clearly being run by Elon Musk. What happened to J.D. Vance? And I don't say that because I am any fan of J.D. Vance, but rather, last I saw, nobody had elected Elon Musk, and everybody is acting as though the richest man in the world buying himself the United States of America is just business as usual. It does strike me that there are at least ways for the media to push back, or for Democrats to push back, or for people who are unhappy with where we are to at least slow the wheels of what Trump is going to try to do. And I think that's a really important focus, and would love to hear what you 3 have to say about it.
This is why I've had sort of hair on fire for the last week. It's very important that Trump meet obstacles as soon as possible, and that some of those obstacles be not obstacles that he can just surmount or easily wave away or crush. And that's why I do think the nominations is very important. The world will look very, very different on January 21st after he's sworn in. If all of his nominees, he's cowed the Senate, they've all just gone along, or if he's succeeded in the recess appointment stuff without serious opposition. That's one scenario. Or 2 or 3 of them have had to been withdrawn. 1 or 2 have even gone to a floor vote and lost. And there's been real uproar about some of them. And there's been business community letters about why the pharmaceutical manufacturers have said, we can't have Robert. We are leading the world. And whatever you think of pharma, they have their issues, but we are leading the world in drug development. We did a pretty good job with mRNA on the COVID vaccine. And you're going to destroy this industry if we go in this direction. I mean, I think Pfizer is not happy about this, but are they going to stick their neck out with the retribution you might get from Trump? But all I'm saying is I very much agree that it's extremely important that there be early obstacles and defeats for Trump. But what worries me the most is I think some of the Democrats and others have talked themselves into, well, we don't want to stick our neck out right now. And we had a election defeat. We have to have 17 seminars about why young male Hispanics are voting or not voting for Harris as much as they should. And then we have to have 6 other seminars on how we reach across the aisle and understand Trump voters. And that'll take us till March. By then, if Trump has momentum going in, it gets very dangerous, I think. people forget what 2017, they did a pretty good job on the left, but I mean, the anti-Trump forces did a pretty good job, I think, of slowing his momentum early. Flynn had to go in the first month because the media looked into Michael Flynn, and he had to withdraw some of his appointments and scandals. So the investigative journalism side of it, the political opposition side of it, the mobilizing of aspects of the business community and civil society side of it. But what worries me the most is the intimidation, that even the parts of civil society, if I could use that term, that are most hostile to Trump, the universities, they got trustees. And I don't know if you're at a big university, I don't know, defer to Heather on this. I suspect the universities are not going to be quite as eager to be the center of militancy against Trump as they were in 2017. Will there be a women's march? Will there be 100,000 lawyers going to the airports to protest the Muslim ban? That was impressive. That made a difference in 2017, in my opinion. What about the deportations? Will that be challenged everywhere? Maybe it will. And look, people are working on it. I don't mean to minimize, and I know some of these people, and they're working very hard, and they're doing their best. So I don't mean to take anything away from them. But I do think it's so important that he hit obstacles early.
But also what Bill is saying is really important, where a lot of obstacles have to be put up in his path. The mirror image of flood the zone with shit. The zone has to be flooded with obstacles. And I'm usually pretty cynical and pessimistic. But if the Democrats cannot turn themselves into the effective opposition they were the first term, then all is lost. Because the whole purpose of a minority party is to oppose. It's almost the easiest thing to do. In the past, it was always kind of the simplest task, just oppose everything. And I will be shocked if the Democrats kind of roll over and stay quiet during this early period.
Well, you did see Joe Manchin said that he was going to go ahead and approve judicial nominees, even if there wasn't Republican support for them, because, as he said, times are now different.
I do think there will be some people out front, and it comes to, a question of their effectiveness. So I just want to second what Mara has said, and Bill, about both the genuine threat, and I know people who are buying insurance, of civil lawsuits, and the genuine threat of violence. There's a general inside-outside problem with Trump, which is that some of the worst things that support him, violent attacks or civil lawsuits by other people. And remember, it's one thing to try to shut down the license of CBS and NBC, but the balkanization has also happened on the left, and you go after one of these new consortiums and shut them down, and that's a real blow. There's just a lot of people acting in his interests who aren't subject to constitutional or political control in the same way. Oh, that's just these crazies out there. But one person we haven't talked about that I think is going to potentially be pivotal on this particular recess appointment idea is Mike Johnson. So the notion that Trump is floating legally, but of course it's like everything else, sort of the bizarro notion of what the law says, is we'll get Mike Johnson to say, hey, there's a recess now. And Thune or the Senate either says, okay, we agree there's a recess, so now there's a recess, and you make a recess appointment, or they disagree, and there's a constitutional provision that can be read to say if there's a disagreement, the president gets to decide if there's a recess, and again, recess appointments.
I don't fully understand this never before used, I guess, presidential ability to adjourn Congress for this, quote, a disagreement, but they will use the law and be lawful in some little way, if I can put it that way, as much as they can.
But Johnson will be totally pliant, you think, or lose his job?
I don't know. He did stand up on Ukraine aid, for example, so there are some things maybe where he doesn't just go along with Trump and with MAGA. And I do think one thing the left should think hard about is what issues they do have actual support among Republicans on, which I say would include Ukraine. I mean, this is where I think Gabbard is in a way more vulnerable. There's still more Reaganism among Republicans on foreign policy, I think, than on some of these other areas where they just don't care or they don't have much sympathy with, undocumented immigrants and so forth. But so I think thinking strategically about that would be worth doing. But I don't know. I've been one who's said over and over, well, surely at this point, someone's going to stand up. And basically for many years, no one much has stood up. And on January 6th, someone stood up. People stood up for like 2 days. And then a week later, there were 10 votes out of 200 in the House to impeach. And then a month later, 7 in the Senate. But there was no need to do anything because the criminal justice system would take care of it. Plus the voters, they were never going to nominate Trump again, and DeSantis and this and that. The amount of rationalization, I think we are kind of past that, you would think. and you can't really rationalize. But I could see in the next 2 months, well, let them have this. These people are incompetent, and we'll make sure we'll get some good assistant secretaries in there to make sure that these departments function okay, and assistant attorney generals, and they'll be gone in 18 months. They probably, have no patience for governance, and so you can see an awful lot of rationalization that will take away the sense of urgency of confronting Trump, I guess, but maybe not. Maybe not.
I have a question for you guys who know better about this. Let's say he pardons, as he has promised to do, the January 6th convicted prisoners, and especially the Proud Boys, some of whom are serving like 20-year sentences for violent crimes. They're out, and they're kind of maybe de facto deputized as his brown shirts, or I don't know what you would call them, because he can pardon them for anything they do after they're out. I mean, is that a totally far-fetched thing, or is that likely to happen?
Or maybe I'll put it this way. I'll ask Heather this question, because this is an American history question to some degree. Not that you only could do American history questions. I mean, the degree to which you can combine the pardon power plus immunity, for that matter, plus having red state governors and law enforcement, and lots of parts of the law enforcement world, which is huge and disparate in America, sympathetic to Trump and to some of the Trumpist agenda. The degree to which you can have a kind of inside-outside government and militia cooperation, let's say, pursuing certain agendas, and that is the South, right, from 1870 to 1920 or beyond 1920, I guess. I don't know how unthinkable is that in certain areas. Would you, you can see you're running the ACLU office in Texas somewhere, and there's a disturbance, or there's a undocumented immigrant fleeing in there to avoid lawful capture, and suddenly there are a bunch of people gather outside to help the law enforcement people do their job. And I don't know if they're literally deputized or they're just treated as kind of allies of law enforcement, and Trump praises them on national television. And I don't know, what does that world look like?
So those are actually two different things. The history of lynching as a form of law enforcement came from the idea that you did not control the government, and therefore you needed to use extra legal means to get the people who were already imprisoned, often because you believed the judges would let them out. And, people forget that one of our most famous and damaging lynching parties was in Cincinnati. It wasn't even in the South, but the idea was that the government had been taken over by the immigrants and the anti-good people voters, and they were going to let off murderers. And therefore, the people had to take that into their own hands. That's a little different, I think, than Mara's saying about the Proud Boys, because I think while they're related in a way, what you're really looking at is the KKK, the neo-Nazis, the militia movement, all of those things that have at least the nod from the government to say, go ahead and do your worst. And I keep thinking about how to write about this. And I've thought this for a very long time. I mean, there's a reason that a number of books ago was How the South Won the Civil War. What they are trying to do, and what they seem to have succeeded at this point in doing, is essentially to turn the entire United States into the American South from 1874 to 1965. And what that is a small group of people controlling the majority and making them live as that small minority wants them to. And from that, there are both the lessons of the fact that you can radicalize people through those gangs, through the KKK, and through, by the way, things like guns. I mean, if you look at the fact that the radical right nowadays embraces guns to the degree they do, when the NRA doesn't really factor into politics anymore, guns have become sort of a way to groom young people into that kind of radicalism politically. There are ways in which you could use the Proud Boys with a nod from Trump and people like them to create what was really the Nazi movement in Germany. It was tried in America in the 1920s, as you know, and it did not take off. I'm not at all convinced it wouldn't take off now.
Oy vey. This leads into where I wanted to kind of end, and Heather, it is with you, and I think you've broached it already, but you wrote on your Substack, Trump appears to see himself as the founder of a new United States of America. Can you just spell out what that means, the new United States of America, and what it means to found it?
Well, you know what? I hadn't thought about this. Interesting, coming right after what I just said to Bill. If you think about the people who organized the Confederate States of America, the elite enslavers who wanted to create a new nation, Essentially, it's the same idea that Trump has, the idea that there are some people who are better than others, and they have the right to rule over those that the former Confederates called mudsills. And those are the ordinary people whose labor creates the value that then concentrates among the hands of those elites who will manage it better than anybody else and move society forward through education and art and through new means of production that'll make things better for everybody, and or at least those at the very top, because the mudsills will always be there. And the Confederates were very clear that they would lead the world in this global oligarchy that essentially enslaved 90% of the people in the world. And it's interesting. I thought about those two things. I had not put them both together at the same time, because very clearly Trump, with these appointments and with his ideology and with the people he surrounds himself with, believes that some people are better than others and that people like him are the real cream of the crop and they're the ones who should run everything. And that is the same ideology as the Confederates, the same ideology of people like Andrew Carnegie, and the same ideology, by the way, of fascism and the Nazis, the idea of castes of people, and there are those who are meant to rule. And so I think what he really imagines, because I maintain he is not a deep thinker, and I maintain he is not mentally healthy and has never been. I mean, one of the things about this moment that's so interesting is he has always had somebody bigger and stronger to protect him from his worst excesses. And now the only person who can do that is Elon Musk, or perhaps an oligarch to whom he looks. I think in his mind, he imagines that he is doing that he is going to start the most powerful nation in the world on this path of, a few people making everything great again. And, I hadn't really thought that one through, but I think that's not an unfair analogy.
I've tried to steer away from analogies of fascism and Hitler and Mussolini all the way through until the very, very end of the election. But I do want to say that it's my understanding, and I'm scared to say this in front of a historian, but that a real important strategy of fascism is to sort of hoodwink the people who you would not for a second think are in that elite cadre into thinking that you're on their side, and also that there's some other Jews, liberal elites, whatever, that are the true enemy that they have to combat by elevating you to further their battles.
Yes, except I don't want to get hung up on the word fascism, because this actually has a very specific definition that I actually don't think Trump and his people are. I think it's a better umbrella is authoritarianism. And that is as American as the Confederates were. So that is part of our history. It's not something that we imported from elsewhere, although we use the same tools. And absolutely. And I guess this is one of the reasons this moment has hit me so hard, is because I believe so firmly in the idea of democracy and in the idea of protecting that democracy the same way that Lincoln did when it rose in his time. And in that era, democracy won. And in this era, I'm not willing to throw in the towel altogether, but boy, was last week a blow to that American dream.
Thank you for the correction on authoritarianism. I mean, we're nearly out of time, and Bill, I'll just cite another tweet this week. That would be yours in all caps. Simple and totally terrifying thought. It is as bad as we thought it might be, actually worse. Seems a kind of summary of this discussion,
So, but I would like to end by, this is the point Heather made at the very, very beginning that we drifted away from, which is, but history is very contingent, and people make mistakes, and other people rise to the occasion, and things happen from the outside that one doesn't expect. And I do very much agree that we shouldn't be fatalistic about this, and we shouldn't make Trump, into some grand world historical figure. I was literally on a panel at Harvard a week ago, in which the person I was on with, I really hate to even go on things with pro-Trump people at this point, but this was more of a Trump acquiescent, nominally not for Trump, but really Trump person. I won't even say who. And so, we've got to admit Trump's kind of a world historical figure, as Hegel said. I mean, it's like, really, he's not Napoleon. He's not Caesar. Lincoln worries in the Lyceum speech that we here there could be a Napoleon, a Caesar, and Alexander who will help destroy American democracy. He is not that. And Bannon is not that. And Elon Musk is not that. And so I do think we should keep it in proportion. And there are plenty of things we can do. People do need to have agency, though. And I am a little worried that there's an awful lot of looking at the spectacle and a little too little of figuring out what people can do to stop the momentum. At first, it's going to be defense. At first, it is going to be slowing the momentum and causing problems. It's not going to be reversing everything overnight. But that really makes a huge difference, as we were saying before, I think.
And that will happen. And you know who hasn't lost any juice, it seems like, or any appetite for the fight are the never Trumpers. They gave up a lot. I mean, you guys, you and your colleagues, they gave up a lot. And Democrats, are back in the fetal position and forming a circular firing squad, which is what they do. But I think they'll get their act together because in the end, yes, it's scarier. There are more threats, physical, career, otherwise, financial. But being in the opposition is relatively straightforward. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure out how to oppose stuff.
There you have it. And I'll just say, has it really only been, less than 2 weeks? Thank you so much, Heather, Mara, Bill. I hope you'll all be back to sound the alarm and prescribe constructive ways ahead. Thank you so much, Heather, Bill, and Mara. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. You can follow us on Twitter at TalkingFedsPod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds is a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producers Gabriella Glick and Becca Havian, sound engineering by Matt McGardle. Rosie Don Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadranathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers. And production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu, Genesis Magpayo, and Sebastian Navarro. Thanks so much to Will Butler for explaining music copyright law. Our music, as always, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.